Think for a second about, how much money a modern company will spend to eliminate like a single second of friction from a customer's online checkout process.
Oh, it's millions of dollars, easily.
Right, millions. Entire teams of UX designers, endless A/B testing, all just to make sure the person buying the product doesn't get frustrated and close the tab.
Yeah, you cannot lose that conversion.
Exactly. Now contrast that with the software the employees of that same company are forced to use every single day to, file their expenses.
Oh, the expense software is always the worst.
It's terrible. Or like the clunky internal database they have to wrestle with just to find the simple document. The asymmetry is actually mind-boggling.
It really is.
And welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a fundamental shift in the competitive landscape. Because in a post-COVID world, characterized by the massive rise of the remote and hybrid workforce.
Which is pretty much everywhere now.
Right. The companies dominating their markets aren't necessarily the ones with the flashiest consumer tech. They are the ones obsessively prioritizing what we call a holistic employee experience.
And it's a massive, recalibration of where a company actually places its value.
How so?
Well, for decades, the workforce was largely treated as a line item on a profit and loss statement, right? Just a cost to be managed.
Yes, strictly numbers.
Exactly. But the organizations thriving right now have flipped that paradigm. They realize that the human beings doing the work are the actual engine of the enterprise. And if that engine is running on fumes, it doesn't really matter how aerodynamic the car is.
That is such a good way to put it. And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We've got a fascinating set of insights from Stella Pop that dissects what actually creates a fulfilling employee experience.
Right, moving past the buzzwords.
Yes, because if you follow organizational leadership, you already know employee experience is thrown around constantly. But we are going to strip away the motivational poster fluff.
Which is desperately needed.
We want to map out the tangible mechanics of this concept, from the moment someone is recruited to the day they eventually move on. So to frame our entire conversation, I want you to keep an analogy in mind.
Okay.
Think of the employee experience not as a human resources checklist, but as a full-scale customer journey map.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, like we track every touch point, every moment of delight, and every friction point for our buyers. We need to apply that exact same rigorous mapping to the people actually building the company.
And the data strongly supports looking at it through that specific lens.
Really? The numbers back that up.
Oh, absolutely. When you treat the employee journey with the same analytical rigor as the customer journey, the return on investment is highly measurable. We aren't just talking about, purely qualitative benefits like a good vibe in the office.
Right. Not just free snacks and ping pong tables.
Exactly. The Stella Pop material points to concrete outcomes. We're talking significant spikes in engagement, higher baseline productivity, and drastically lower absenteeism.
People actually show up because the environment doesn't actively drain them.
Yes. But I take it a step further. The quality of the output fundamentally changes.
I mean, that makes sense.
Right, because when you lower internal friction and increase fulfillment, that internal satisfaction inevitably bleeds outward. The people interfacing with your external customers are more patient, they're more creative, and they're just more invested in the product.
So the internal culture is really the leading indicator of your external market success.
100%.
Okay, so if a mapped, frictionless journey is the destination, we have to talk about the pavement we are building the road on. Let's start with the foundation.
The bedrock.
Exactly. Before we can even touch the day-to-day mechanics of a job, the source emphasizes that the absolute bedrock of this entire framework is trust and leadership accountability.
It has to be.
Because if those elements are missing, any perks or wellness programs or, flashy software you roll out, they're completely meaningless.
They just become transparent attempts at manipulation.
Yeah.
And people see right through that.
They really do.
The material highlights that trust has to be a two-way street, which, sounds incredibly basic until you look at the psychological mechanics of what happens when mutual trust is actually present.
Right.
We all know the team needs to trust the organization to be stable, but when the organization explicitly trusts the team, meaning a deliberate departure from that surveillance culture that crept in during the remote work.
Oh, like the mouse jigglers and screen trackers.
Exactly. When you drop that and actually trust people, it alters the cognitive landscape of the workplace.
How so? Like, what is actually happening in the brain when that trust is established?
It's really about psychological safety. When employees feel trusted, They aren't worried about being micromanaged or, penalized for stepping slightly out of bounds to solve a problem.
Right, they aren't constantly looking over their shoulder.
Exactly. And biologically, their brains aren't burning energy on defensive posturing. The amygdala, which is the part of the brain constantly scanning for threats, it actually powers down.
Oh, wow, so it's a literal physiological shift.
It is. And that allows the prefrontal cortex, the area that handles complex problem solving and creativity, to fully engage. Mutual trust literally unlocks a higher level of cognitive function.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, and that is why collaboration and retention skyrocket in high-trust environments.
Okay, I definitely buy the psychology behind trust, but the source immediately pairs it with C-suite accountability, and I have to push back here a little bit.
Okay, let's hear it.
Accountability is one of those, Teflon buzzwords executives love to use in all-hands meetings.
Oh, for sure.
But if I'm a mid-level manager or a frontline worker, how does a C-suite leader tangibly demonstrate this accountability on a random Tuesday afternoon? I mean, what does it actually look like in the wild?
That's a crucial distinction to make, and the source defines this very specifically. C-suite accountability in this context is not about taking the blame for a missed quarterly earnings target.
Right.
It is defined as a leader being actively responsive to the workers, prioritizing their experience over immediate, short-term business conveniences.
So actively choosing the employee over the immediate bottom line.
Exactly.
Give me an example of that trade-off.
Well, think about a scenario where a critical client is making unreasonable, totally out-of-scope demands that are forcing a team to work their third consecutive weekend.
We've all been there.
Right. Accountability on a random Tuesday means the executive steps in, pushes back on that lucrative client, and actually protects the team's boundaries.
Wow.
It is verbal commitment. It's proving through resource allocation and hard decisions that the human beings doing the work are valued above the immediate financial transaction.
And when a leader authentically models that, the trust we just talked about is cemented.
Exactly. It proves it's real.
That makes perfect sense. It's the say-do ratio. You can't just say you care about burnout. You have to actively reject the revenue that causes it.
Precisely.
All right, so let's assume we have that solid bedrock. The leaders are genuinely accountable. The trust is mutual. Now we move from the philosophical to the physical reality of the workday.
The day-to-day mechanics.
Right. What happens when the employee actually sits down at their desk? This revolves around three massive components: alignment, the technology stack, and how recognition is handled.
And it's important to note that these three components constantly interact. If we look at alignment first, it's about providing clarity of purpose.
Okay.
But it goes beyond just, reciting the company mission statement. Employees need to know the rules of the game they are playing. Leadership must set transparent goals, define clear milestones, and establish the specific metrics that equal success.
It reminds me of the military concept of commander's intent.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you just give someone a rigid list of tasks, they freeze the second a variable changes. But if you give them absolute clarity on the ultimate objective, like what a successful outcome actually looks like, they can adapt and steer the mission themselves.
That is a fantastic parallel. Without those defined metrics for success, employees are basically forced to guess what leadership wants.
And guessing is stressful.
Exactly. Guessing breeds anxiety, and chronic anxiety destroys the employee experience. When the milestones are clear, they can connect their daily effort to the overarching vision.
But knowing the destination is only half the battle. They need a vehicle to get there. And this is where the source dives into the technology tools.
The tech stack.
Yeah, and the material explicitly notes that workplace tech needs to integrate without copious amounts of head banging and aspirin.
Which is a great line.
It really is. We always talk about tech making things faster, but I want to talk about how bad tech actually causes physical and mental exhaustion.
It absolutely does.
Imagine you have an employee who is completely aligned. They know the mission, they have commander's intent, they genuinely want to win, but you are forcing them to run a marathon while wearing heavy, rigid combat boots.
The boots being the clunky internal software.
Exactly. It does not matter how bought in they are. If their daily tools like the CRM, the communication platform, the expense software we joked about, cause them physical and mental friction every single time they click a button, their sheer willpower is going to run out.
Yep.
They are either going to fail the mission or they are going to quit the race entirely.
The mechanism behind your combat boot analogy is actually known as cognitive load theory.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, the human brain only has a finite amount of executive function to deploy on any given day. When your technology is seamless and intuitive, it basically becomes invisible.
You just use it without thinking.
Right. But when tech is poorly designed, it forces the user to think about how to use the tool, rather than thinking about the problem they are actually trying to solve.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
You are essentially bleeding your employees' cognitive energy on administrative friction. The tech must be seamless so that their mental bandwidth is reserved for high-level innovation.
You remove the friction so the engine can actually rev. And once that engine is revving and they are doing great work, we hit the critical component of recognition. But the source frames this as much more than just, a public pat on the back in the Slack channel.
Right, because public praise is nice, but it's kind of a sugar rush.
Yeah.
The source defines meaningful recognition as identifying latent potential in someone and then actively nurturing it. It is a forward-looking investment.
So it's less about saying, great job on that spreadsheet yesterday, and more about saying, hey, the analytical skills you showed on that spreadsheet tell me you have the capacity to lead our next data strategy initiative.
Spot on. It's equipping the team with the skills they need to advance. The neurochemistry of recognition is actually really fascinating.
How so?
Well, when you identify someone's potential, you trigger dopamine loops related to future rewards and status. You aren't just rewarding past behavior, you are architecting their future trajectory within your company.
And that's what permanently boosts loyalty, which provides a really seamless transition into the deeper human element of this deep dive. We've covered how the work is done, the goals, the tools, the forward-looking recognition. Now we have to look at why the work is done and how it impacts the employee on an existential level.
The human element.
Yeah. The source zeroes in on impact, connection, and growth. Let's unpack impact first, because we aren't just talking about making the company more money.
No, true fulfillment requires a sense of purpose. Humans have a deep-seated psychological need to know that their labor actually matters to the wider world.
Right.
The force argues that leadership must intentionally connect the dots for the employee, showing them exactly how their specific, seemingly isolated tasks contribute to a larger, meaningful outcome.
It's the concept of line of sight, right?
Yes, exactly.
I always think about a supply chain analyst at a pharmaceutical company. If their line of sight stops at their computer monitor, their job is just moving numbers around on a screen to optimize shipping routes.
Which is incredibly dry.
Yeah. Very dry. But if leadership extends that line of sight, that analyst realizes they aren't just moving numbers. They're ensuring that a shipment of insulin gets to a rural hospital before a weather system shuts down the roads.
Wow, yeah.
They're literally keeping people alive.
And when you establish that line of sight to the end user, the work entirely transforms. The employee takes profound ownership of the outcome because the abstract task has been anchored to a tangible human impact.
But they aren't working in a vacuum. Which brings us to connection, which I honestly think is the most precarious element in the modern work era.
It is definitely the most challenging right now.
Job satisfaction is deeply tethered to a sense of belonging and having meaningful relationships with coworkers. In a traditional office, this happened organically through, just proximity. But the source is very clear that in a hybrid or remote world, companies have to intentionally manufacture this connection.
Because you no longer have natural propinquity.
What's that?
It's the psychological tendency for people to form relationships simply because they physically cross paths frequently.
Oh, right.
The casual collisions at the water cooler, they're gone. So if a company doesn't intentionally design spaces and structures for people to interact outside of transactional project updates, isolation sets in very quickly.
And isolation is the absolute enemy of the employee experience.
It is.
Now, the final piece of this human element is growth. And this is where I want to play devil's advocate for a moment.
Go for it.
The source insists that companies must provide opportunities for professional and personal growth. Now, I understand paying for a coding boot camp or a management seminar, but does personal growth really belong on a corporate balance sheet?
It's a fair question.
Right. Shouldn't a business just focus on the skills that directly yield a return on investment and leave the personal development to the individual's free time?
It's a very common challenge, and it cuts to the core of the old transactional social contract between employer and employee. The outdated view says, we buy your time and your hard skills, period. But the Stella Pop source completely rejects that binary. It argues that you cannot separate the professional from the personal because the human brain doesn't compartmentalize growth that cleanly.
Give me an example of how they bleed together.
Okay, let's say a company provides a structured opportunity for an employee to lead a highly complex, diverse team through a difficult transition. The hard skill there is project management.
Right.
But the personal growth required to succeed, developing deep empathy, learning how to regulate their own stress under pressure, building cognitive flexibility, those are profound personal evolutions.
I see.
Overcoming significant challenges at work fundamentally builds personal resilience. When a company intentionally supports the holistic development of the person, that individual feels seen as a three-dimensional human being.
And the resulting loyalty and fulfillment probably dwarf whatever it costs to facilitate that growth.
Absolutely.
I see the through line now. If my workplace is the forge that is making me a sharper, more capable, more resilient human being in all aspects of my life, my ties to that organization become incredibly deep.
Precisely.
So we've explored the philosophy. We understand the psychology of trust, the cognitive load of bad tech, the line of sight for impact, and the value of holistic growth. But philosophy doesn't write the schedule for Monday morning.
No, it doesn't.
How does a company actually operationalize this? The final section of the material provides the blueprint. This is about moving from theory to practice.
And the blueprint begins with a pretty stark reality check. Building this experience is not a one-and-done initiative. You cannot just hold a mandatory seminar, buy everyone lunch, and declare the corporate culture fixed.
Which so many companies try to do.
Oh, all the time. But the source insists this must be treated as an ongoing core business strategy where the higher purpose is consistently front and center.
It has to be treated like a product that is constantly iterating. And one of the foundational steps they recommend is running reflection and exploration exercises. Because fulfillment is highly subjective, right?
Right.
What makes me feel energized might totally drain you. So the company has to help the employee identify their own unique sources of fulfillment.
It's about shifting the dynamic. The company acts as a facilitator of the employee's self-discovery, rather than trying to dictate a one-size-fits-all definition of happiness.
But the company still has to build the playground where that discovery happens. And I have to say, this is where the Stella Pop material really shines for me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because it avoids the tired, vague corporate advice like host a team-building retreat. Instead, it demands structured, formal programs, and it names a few specific ones. Innovation labs, stretch assignments, rotational apps, and milestone experiences.
Yes.
Let's actually define these because they are incredibly powerful tools.
Let's start with rotational apps, which is essentially an internal gig economy or a cross-training program. What happens when you implement that structurally?
Well, you pull someone entirely out of their echo chamber.
Nicely. You take a data engineer and embed them in the customer support department for a month, or you have a product designer shadow the sales team. Structurally, you are breaking down the operational silos. But psychologically, you are functioning as an empathy machine. The engineer suddenly understands the immense frustration the support team deals with when a feature breaks.
They build deep cross-departmental relationships that would never happen in a standard workflow.
Exactly. That immediately solves the connection problem we talked about earlier.
Okay, and what about stretch assignments?
Stretch assignments are deliberate challenges given to an employee that sit just outside their current competency level. It is a controlled environment for them to struggle, learn, and ultimately succeed.
It's the practical application of that personal and professional growth.
Yes.
And milestone experiences. We aren't just talking about giving someone a crystal paperweight for their 5-year anniversary, right?
Not at all. Milestone experiences are curated moments that recognize significant contributions or transitions. It could be, leading a major pitch for the first time or officially mentoring a junior hire.
It's about creating corporate rituals that mark the passage of time and the accumulation of expertise.
Which creates a deep sense of belonging.
But for any of these specific structural programs to actually work, the source brings us to the ultimate operational requirement: cultivating a culture of purpose that gives leaders free rein to model these behaviors. That phrase, free rein, is critical.
It is the linchpin. If a mid-level manager identifies that one of their team members desperately needs a stretch assignment to stay engaged, but that manager has to jump through 3 weeks of bureaucratic red tape and HR approvals to make it happen, the moment is lost.
The friction kills the initiative.
Exactly. If the C-suite has genuinely established the trust and accountability we opened the show with, they will push the authority downward. They will empower their managers to build teams intentionally and deploy these shared experiences on the fly.
It is a cascading effect.
Trust at the top allows for agility at the team level, which creates fulfillment for the individual.
So, bringing this all together, building an employee experience that is, as the source calls it, a darn good one, requires intense, intentional, and continuous work.
It really does.
It requires overhauling tech stacks to reduce cognitive friction, architecting structured rotational programs, and having leaders who prioritize human beings over immediate margins. It is difficult. But the bottom line of this deep dive is that it is absolutely mandatory for survival.
It is the only viable path forward in this landscape. The material urges every listener to run a diagnostic on their own organization. Look at your current success metrics and then realistically assess the gap between where you are and your ultimate potential.
And usually that gap is pretty telling.
In almost every case, that gap is dictated by the unseen friction in your employee experience. Your team is your most potent asset. If you treat them merely as a cost to be managed, you will invariably lose them to a competitor who treats them as an investment to be optimized.
It brings us right back to the customer journey map. We obsess over the lifetime value of a customer, but we need to obsess over the lifetime value of an employee. And that leads to a final thought I want to leave you with today.
Let's hear it.
We didn't touch on this directly, but it builds on everything we've unpacked. Think about your own daily routine. If you were to map out your journey from the day you were hired to this exact moment, where is the biggest gap between the tasks you perform and the impact that actually brings you fulfillment?
That's a powerful question.
Something to mull over as you analyze your own employee experience. That's all for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.